Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In 2017, over 47,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. That's more deaths than during the height of the AIDS epidemic. But despite all the efforts of politicians and regulators and doctors to address the epidemic, it's only become more deadly. While problems with opium definitely don't start in the 21st century, it's been around since basically the beginning of human civilization. And different cultures have dealt with opium in very different ways. Sometimes it was prescribed directly from soldiers and given to them before battle began, like Alexander the Great may have done with his troops. Other times it was completely criminalized. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. John Halpern and David Blistein, authors of the book Opium, How an Ancient Flower Shaped and Poisoned Our World. We talk about the discovery of poppy artifacts in ancient Mesopotamia, and look at how Greek physicians discovered opium's effects and refined its power, and how colonial empires marketed it around the world, and Britain basically forced China to legalize opium because they wanted to not have a trade deficit, and eventually how international drug companies developed a range of powerful synthetic opioids that led to an epidemic of addiction. So in this episode, we get into the vast history of opium and into the 20th century with the war on drugs. David and John also talk about a combination of strategies to reduce addiction and overdose based directly on historical episodes where they think that governments did deal with it in the best way possible. So this is a deep dive into an issue with a lot of contemporary significance. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with John Halpern and David Blistein. John and David, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with opium. That seems like a great place to start. So what effect does opium have chemically on the body?
So opium contains the key constituents that form the basis of all opiate medications up until the modern era, where we now have synthetic opiates as well. But prior to 50 plus roughly years ago, all of our opiate pain medications derive from the opium poppy. So the effects are well known. They are potent analgesics. They take away pain, but over time, tolerance builds, and that causes dependence and side effects. The effects of this pain reliever include sedation and cognitive smushing at the higher doses, so a person becomes fuzzy, and there's a lack of awareness that happens with chronic use. You know, people think, for example, that there must be something directly bad about heroin, that most people with heroin dependence wind up having horrible dentition. But it's really because they're so chronically addicted to the opiate that they stop paying attention to brush their teeth, and that's why they start losing teeth. Well, this is something that's documented all the way back into the ancient times, when people wind up becoming regular users and habituated to it. The concept of addiction, evolved over time, and so our relationship culturally with chronic use has changed over time. But the effects from way back in ancient times would be very familiar to anybody who struggles with opiate addiction today.
And we're going to talk about different historical figures who consume it, going from thousands of years in the past up to the 21st century. But how is it consumed? What are the ways that people would consume opium in the past and today?
So the primary way would be to just eat the collected resin from the pods, or pickling the pods and making a kind of deconcoction that way, or drying them and then reconstituting them as a tea. There's some evidence that dry pods may have been thrown onto fires, and that the smoke released from that may have intoxicated those nearby. But there was no, intravenous drug use back in ancient times, because we didn't have the needle to inject into back then, the drug. So mostly orally consumed, the majority of it, but there was some evidence of it that it may have been smoked too.
Have you come across theories on how it was first consumed? Was it just in the process of herb gathering and consumption of different medicinal herbs, someone realized, oh, this has painkiller effects? Or do you know of any of those theories?
Yeah, this is something that's really fascinating, and David can weigh in on this also, but ancient representations of opium include imagery that clearly indicate that the pods were cut open to milk the resin out of the plant, which is, of course, how it's collected and then brought together to form straw opium, which is then refined to heroin. So we do know that the very process that leads to heroin is something that harkens back to methods from ancient times.
Yeah, and I would say that as far, Neolithic is definitely more like John was talking about, probably smoke, it probably fires, accidental, sucking on different herbs, to see what they were like and getting lucky and getting an opium poppy. But then after, back Homeric times, the Trojan War, we know they were doing something, and I assume it's mixing with alcohol is probably the first thing to make some kind of tincture. That's my guess, because the way that, and John might be able to explain this, the way they process opium to make it so-called smoking opium, which makes it much more biologically available. And so the real good smoking opium didn't come until more modern age.
Yeah, I'm curious, now that we're getting into where opium shows up in the historical record, how is it presented in the oldest accounts that we have of it? Is it something that sounds like everybody knows about it and it's just a part of the fabric of life? Or is it more, we have discovered this new type of medicine and it seems more of a curio or something rare? How is it first introduced from what we know in the historical record?
When you really get to the... Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say the thing that captured me is that it's so important that the earliest artistic representations in any recorded history include the opium poppy. The opium poppy and the pomegranate were the earliest symbols of fertility. One opium poppy contains 20,000 seeds. And so from a modern perspective, there's not going to be any prevention fully of cultivation of the opium poppy, where just one pod of one flower can resume cultivation on a very large scale. But the earliest representations, and you can imagine that opium would be very important then it once discovered for its medicinal properties for childbirth, where there's extreme pain in the birthing process. And so it was woven from the earliest recordings of civilization.
There's an Egyptian herbal that's called a remedy for crying children, of which we think there may have been some overdoses when those children were crying a lot and given a lot of opium. So there start to be written records, and John's right, you see them in carvings and stuff in ancient Sumeria, and most fun, you see them represented in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were mystical ceremonies in ancient Greece. And then once you get into after 1000 BC, you start to see written records. And I think what's interesting about those is the most interesting ones have to do with war, just like heroin was involved in Vietnam, people trying to kill the pain of war. And the first one they talk about is in Helen of Troy after the war gave her husband and some other guys were sitting around telling war stories, and they all started crying. And she got tired of all this sobbing, so she mixed together some opium and some other remedies, and soon they were having a good time telling war stories again. So there's that. Alexander the Great, there's some controversy, but he was injured a lot during during his campaigns, and for him to use opium would be as natural as using aspirin today. And then my favorite, where there's also controversy, is Marcus Aurelius. Now we're in the 100 AD. He was given maintenance doses by a very famous physician named Galen, who you might know about.
When people understand it's a painkiller, I'm sure they understand it's addictive as well. How is it used? Is it primarily something in an ancient doctor's medical bag? Is it also used in religious ceremonies? Or are there cases of it being a recreational drug as well?
All three. I mean, I think any herbal back then will include opium, and the serious ones, serious opiate-type drugs were what John Henbane, opium, and hemlock, which is what Socrates did himself in with, although there might have been some opium involved then. Recreational, it's a little funny, certainly in spiritual, mystical practices. It seems that, again, ancient Rome, they were drinking wine, they were doing opium. They didn't make the distinction, right, John, that we make today between that.
So in ancient Greece also, since they were great seafaring traders and might not know every language of the people that they would come to try to sell their wares, were very big on symbolism. If you take the large ampuras that from these trading vessels that would contain wine, well, often the descriptions from ancient times is of fortified wines. Well, what are they fortified with? So if you take the shape of an ampura, and you imagine it being sealed, and you go to a new land where you don't speak the language, you lift up the ampura, it doesn't register. Well, turn it upside down. What shape is it? The shape is very similar to the shape of an opium poppy. So it could very well be that opium was woven through the great trading of the ancient era and helped spread communication and seafaring to expand wealth.
It was also a great coin. Along with gold, it was a great small trading coin that you could use for trade. And there's no question that there have been DNA discoveries of opium residue in the amphora and in various other ceremonial and recreational artifacts.
Are there any attempts at ancient regulation of opium?
I can't, John, can you think of any? I can't think of any in my reading. Not until the Chinese. Not until China, which had used opium as a part of their medicinal probably since 2,000 or 3,000 BC, suddenly we're having opium forced on them by the West, and they started to try to have regulations starting around 1600, all of which were about as successful as the ones now. In other words, not.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to just do a little more setup before we get to all these other issues, too. You mentioned the first recorded drug crisis in Persia. About what period is this, approximately?
Which one are we talking about now? You mean in the 900s when medical people?
Right, when we're jumping up into the Middle Ages, but before we get more of the international commerce of the Silk Road and it gets all over the place. So what happened with that one?
It absolutely was a major drug back then, and from one of my favorites is Moses Maimonides, the famous Jewish physician scholar, insisted that it be used for end-of-life pain. You should not deny it, even if people can't afford it. Then there was the famous, the 900s AD were one of the most phenomenal, enlightened medicinal periods in history, medical periods in history, and no one writes about it. There were they wrote huge tracts about it. One person wrote a whole book about opium. And so then it was mostly medicinal, but as always happens with doctors, some get addicted in the process of figuring out how the thing works. And one of them was the most famous doctor at the time named Avicenna, who grew up around the poppy fields of Persia and ended up getting addicted towards the end of his life.
Oh, really? Okay. He's one of the most prolific writers out there. I didn't know that about him. Yeah, he wrote on literally everything, and he even knew about the Mozart effect, music having, neurological development. Interesting. Yeah, when you're talking about medical advancements, for context, just for listeners, that this is mostly around the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East and where a lot of this research is being done. So you mentioned he got addicted, but did he see some sort of wide-scale social problem happening, or was it more on a person-by-person basis that he understood the dangers of opium?
I don't think it was seen as much of a social problem from what I've read. Of course, neither was it seen as a social problem in the 1800s in America as much as it is today. John, I don't know if you remember anything from that period. They didn't talk about it that way back then. In your thing about hashish, your show about that, making things socially unacceptable is a fairly recent phenomenon.
So back then, much of the writing has to do with how something can be used and can also be a point of harm. There's a great belief, of course, that poisons may have medicinal properties, and you should build smaller doses to build up tolerance to that. And so there's this understanding of building up a tolerance to a poison, for